When did you first start interacting with GraphQL? Was that at WorkPop already, or did that happen at Gatsby?
It was at WorkPop in 2015, very early into GraphQL. And at that point, it was the era of you have to convince people to use GraphQL.
Mm-hmm.
So I lived through that, having to write big proposals on adding a GraphQL server to the code base and really like negotiating like, oh, we're only going to do one resolver first, and we'll see how it goes. And then the boss is like, okay, how are we going to track metrics on this? And then we're like, well, there's no instrumentation libraries for GraphQL yet. Okay, we have to instrument this ourselves. All right. Now we're like running Prometheus against a GraphQL server. Then the next people are like, okay, how are you going to make sure we have alerting and uptime on the GraphQL? It's like, okay, now we got to go do that. There was no, how are we going to cache this stuff? Still wasn't figured out, right? Until recently. But that's the era that I started in. And people just like were shaming GraphQL. It was like REST versus GraphQL and all that stuff.
Why at that time already were you like, at WorkPop, we should use GraphQL? What was sort of the problem you were trying to solve for? Or why in 2015 were you like, we should bet on this super early technology where we have to build our own instrumentation, alerting, caching? How did that come to be?
So we made I'm not trying to be mean when I say this. In 2014, we built WorkPop's initial product with MeteorJS. Mm-hmm. And if those who don't know MeteorJS, it had essentially client, it was a full stack framework where you could essentially have MongoDB on the client and the server, and you had this you weren't using REST, you were using WebSockets for everything. And so we were in this world. And the problem with Meteor is if your site is very static, you don't need to have live query subscriptions on every page. It's not something that your app needs. You're not Uber, you're just let's say you're Indeed.com or Craigslist. Why do you need live queries on a page that content never changes, right? So it has a lot of performance implications when you're a startup and you're actually starting to scale, and every query your app makes is a live query, mm-hmm. right? So now your database is always at 100% CPU, etc. And then we could have gone to REST, but then we were like, why not? If we're already in this bleeding edge world of Meteor, then our tolerance for more bleeding edge stuff is actually lower or higher. So we started investigating GraphQL. And it just so happened at the time, Meteor broke off. Literally, while at the same time, Meteor broke off into Apollo. And so we, as Meteor customers, we got first look into React Apollo Client. I even contributed a bunch to Apollo Client back in the day, just to prove to the engineering managers at my company that this will not shoot us in the foot. So that's kind of how we started. If Meteor never went into Apollo, who knows where that'd be? I don't even know. The whole world would be different if you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. Apollo invested a lot into the GraphQL ecosystem early on. We got get like we talked with Peggy, right? Apollo's done a lot of stuff for the GraphQL community, and really GraphQL wouldn't be where it is without them. I love that you were using Meteor and you struggled with your scaling, because that's very reminiscent of the journey we went through I went through it at Spectrum with the team there, because we weren't using Meteor, but we were also very real-time heavy, right? Spectrum was sort of this attempt at building a public chat platform, which should already tell you a lot about first the real-time implications of it, but also the scaling implications of it, right? And we ran into the exact same troubles with making every data requirement real-time is really expensive on your database and just entire infrastructure. We eventually also switched to GraphQL, and we're much, much happier with it than we were with, I think we were using Firebase at the beginning. So totally get that. So you're at WorkPop, you've convinced your managers and the rest of the team to work with a GraphQL API. How long did you end up staying at WorkPop after that, and what did that GraphQL API evolve to?
Yeah, so I stayed at WorkPop from I was the 7th employee, and I left when we got sold, right? So the whole time. And GraphQL started off as a single GraphQL server that, was talking to our monolithic database, and we just shipped it as a Node.js server that went alongside the Meteor app. And certain pages of the Meteor app would call into this GraphQL API, and we'd start doing incremental adoption and moving away from Meteor. And then more teams at WorkPop wanted to use GraphQL, and we already had we started building out a service-oriented architecture. So every service we have, and this is kind of how Gatsby works today, Gatsby Cloud that is, every service has its own database and it has its own GraphQL server. So what we would do is we'd have like essentially GraphQL services everywhere, and services can communicate to each other through GraphQL, and it was all fine and dandy. But for our essentially our front end endpoint, we really wanted to kind of stitch together, and this is before schema stitching, but we wanted to stitch together all these services into a single API. So back then I worked with Jonas from Apollo and Sashko and Mikhail, who actually worked at Gatsby as well later on. He was working on his own GraphQL product at the time. But we all got together and we were talking about schema stitching, and that's kind of where like the schema stitching APIs came from in GraphQL tools. And so we then adopted schema stitching. I had my own version of schema stitching, which would do essentially like you would introspect the schema anytime the service boots up, and you'd have like a gateway that would be introspecting all schemas and putting them all together. And then now you have like a single API, and that worked fine, except when one of your services went down, your gateway needs to know and re-introspect, and then your whole service goes down. So we had all these like small problems with like just availability and reliability of the gateway. And then when we left, it became more of like how it is now. A federation didn't exist, but I had written my own version of federation at WorkPop. I used to do that a lot, just like write my own versions of things. I don't do that anymore. But we had our own kind of Apollo federation type of thing where you'd have different graphs, you'd combine them to a single service. At build time, it would introspect schemas at build time and generate different GraphQL APIs and, all that type of good stuff. And yeah, and then I think the industry kind of settled on schema stitching as not the best idea, right? Or used federation is pretty much what people say now. So I think I was on the right track, is what I'm saying. Yeah.